Welcome back. I'm Melissa Harris Perry. The Republican presidential primary has been dominated by unlikely outsider candidates whose total lack of political experience seems to be their primary political appeal in their bid for president. And as we saw this week, the establishment candidates, the good on paper candidates, the governors, the men whose resumes include successful political campaigns and years of experience running state governments, well, they're angry that they're losing to the outsiders. Very angry.
To talk about we're just going to have a 10% tithe and that's how we're going to fund the government, and we're going to just fix everything with waste, fraud, and abuse, or that we're just going to be great, or we're going to ship 10 million Americans or 10 million people out of this country, leaving their children here in this country and dividing families. Folks, we got to wake up. We cannot elect somebody that doesn't know how to do the job.
Don't vote for me if you want to keep the gridlock in Washington, D.C.
Let's stop fooling around about this. Let's tell people the truth. For once, let's do that and stop trying to give them some kind of fantasy that's never going to come true.
It troubles me that people are rewarded for tearing down our country. It's never been that way in American politics before.
This stuff is fantasy, just like getting rid of Medicare and Medicaid.
You said yesterday.
Come on, that's just not... You don't scare senior citizens with that. It's not responsible.
We have to offer a compelling alternative that is based on hope and optimism and grounded in serious policy, which I've laid out, and you can go get it at jeb2016.com.
Thank you, Governor.
So these are the guys who have every reason to believe that they should have been leading the field, and they're not going to take it anymore. We're calling it the establishment strikes back. Joining me now, John Opdycke, who is president of Open Primaries, a group dedicated to an open and nonpartisan primary system. Cristina Beltran, associate professor of social and cultural analysis and the director of Latino studies at New York University. Susan Del Percio, Republican strategist, and Wes Lowry, political reporter at the Washington Post. So, Susan, I think the last time you were here, actually, you expressed some concern about what happens if the establishment candidates don't really kind of show up in the primaries. And in fact, it looks like they showed up at this last debate. I'm wondering sort of where you are on this right now.
Well, it's funny. We did this autopsy, the political autopsy, after 2012, which has now become infamous. And what it said is we had to have broader appeal. The other thing it said was governors are better candidates because they have executive experience, and yet they're not associated with Washington, D.C. So they did everything right. Now, I understand their frustration, but what I think the missing component that no one realized was people are so frustrated because our elected officials are not being held accountable. And that's the tie that brings these former governors or current governors into Washington experience and government experience. We don't hold our government officials accountable, and that's Donald Trump's message right there. At the end of the day, no matter how you look at it now, I happen to think he's very weak on offering the specifics. I think Kasich is right about that. I think Christie is right. Those were all good points. But he says, if you don't do the job, you're fired. And that's what people want to hear. You're going to hold people accountable. Sure, you may not get it right. Sure, we may not agree with you, switch your positions and all that. But at the end of the day, you're going to be held accountable. And that's what at least the Republican voters want.
So it's an interesting point, John. I'm wondering if what we're seeing here in this moment, so kind of the rise of these unlikely candidates, if that is unusual, if it's sort of an anomaly in this particular 2016 moment, or if you see it actually as a feature of partisan primaries that might be different if we were in an open primary system.
I think that it's directly tied to the fact that the primaries themselves are closed. They're run by the parties. They've created a situation that the will of the American people is very difficult to express itself, and you end up with candidates that don't really reflect that. However, this is not just about 2016. There is an anger in this country that has been building. Look at 1992. Ross Perot was at 42% in the polls at that time. The American people are deeply frustrated with both political parties, with the ways in which they silo and corral people into these different segments that are doing war with each other, and there's no opportunity or little opportunity for constructive, honest, developmental dialogue that could move the country forward.
So I'm so interested in that idea of frustration, and I'm wondering in part if that frustration sometimes also emerges from a lack of information about how the process works. So I both want to acknowledge that I think that frustration does exist, and that part of it is in part descriptive about an idea about accountability. But I also wonder if some of it is also just rooted in like a not quite getting, and I don't mean this in like, oh, they're dumb. I just mean it's actually complicated to understand how an idea goes from an idea to policy.
To policy. And I think this actually tells us a story about how rhetoric matters and how governing versus running for office matters. Because I actually think that for the Republicans, this is a hell of their own making, right? Because I think basically, and this includes the establishment, that if you run for office and you say that government is the problem, not the solution, if you say Washington is a cesspool, if you demonize your opponents and you say things like, you know, Obamacare marks the end of freedom as we know it, and you speak about government in these apocalyptic terms, and then you turn at the point when you're in office and you have to then tell voters, you know, compromise is necessary, change takes time. These are, you know, you've been offering simple answers to complex problems, and all of a sudden you say that, voters not surprisingly feel lied to and they feel betrayed. And I think what that tells us is that political rhetoric matters, and that if we have simple answers, you know, then if you offer simple answers, they're going to balk at complex solutions. And I think that if you run for office and you try to produce fear and anger and resentment, you end up with fearful, scared, and angry voters.
But that's exactly what happened.
So it's a hell of their own
House,
making. It's the hell of their own making. For 40 years since Reagan.
The problem is, if you just take a recent example with the House having to elect a new speaker, is that those folks that
the Freedom Caucus
wouldn't compromise and scintilla. And they wouldn't offer. So it's almost opposite. They believe, but they go home and they say, if you don't get everything, we were going to fight. And they're the ones who actually cause more of the problems than the folks who say, we have to compromise.
Right, exactly.
That's been those, and from the right and the left.
Right. I was going to say, as much as I agree on the deep relevance of discourse and the way that like government is the problem can then make it hard to be part of the government. Let me also say, I feel like I have also seen some of that happening on the left, even with a hope and optimism about sort of, you know, I can go and solve it, right? Or me and my crew can solve it. But when in fact, literally, it can't just be solved by a better person, like the system itself. And so Wes, part of what I'd be interested in knowing from you, just as you've talked to voters, folks in Iowa, in New Hampshire, like what parts of what you're hearing here end up getting reflected?
Of course, well, and I think that this is a good, and I think you're both making this point. This idea that we've had a conversation now for a long time. And I used to cover Congress, and so I covered a lot of these types of tell me about it. And so there was always this, you know, we have to remember even just our recent history. The push, the Republicans coming in 2010 and taking control of the House, largely on the back of this being a mandate to obstruct President Obama, a mandate to try to overturn Obamacare, something that arguably was never going to happen legislatively. And yet this was what Republican voters were being sold for the last 8 years, was this idea that we are going to undo these things and change these things. Now there's a deep frustration among many Republican voters who I've spoken with because those things didn't happen. And so you had this promising from both Democrats on the left of things that were going to be accomplished that have not been accomplished, and Republicans on the right of things that were going to be accomplished that have not been accomplished.
I mean, that explains Bernie Sanders.
And John, I cut you off. It does explain Bernie Sanders.
Conservatives are deeply distrustful of a GOP establishment they see as hypocritical and just flat out lying. Progressives are concerned that Clintonism is a complete sellout of progressive ideals. Independents are now 45% of the whole country. That's surging. So you have an environment in which there is deep dissatisfaction with the political institutions, with the political parties, and yet the political system, starting with the primaries, is set up to give maximal control to the parties.
Right.
And that is creating a gap between the people and how the parties govern that is widening every day. We don't just have an income inequality gap, we have a political gap in the country.
It's a really interesting question. I want to come back to it as we come back, because I want to talk a little bit about Jeb Bush and the question of these parties. But the thing that you've just laid out there about the relevance of parties, that's a historical reality about how those institutions have grown. I keep thinking about John Aldrich's book, Why Parties? And the answer is because it's hard to organize a big country like this into just two groups. Okay, more. We'll get nerdy in that break. Jeb Bush is ready to launch his Jeb Can Fix It tour, but what is it he's trying to fix?